In the early 18th century, long before satellites, radio signals, or accurate maps of the oceans, there existed places where a human being could vanish completely. Entire islands lay unvisited for decades, known only as vague shapes on a sailor's memory. It was in this quieter, slower world that a man named Alexander Selkirk stepped onto the shore of a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, believing his stay would be temporary. He watched his ship disappear beyond the horizon, shrinking into the blue distance, until it became nothing more than a line between sea and sky. At that moment, Selkirk still believed rescue would come. Days would pass, perhaps weeks. He could not yet imagine that this shoreline would become the center of his entire world for years beyond counting. The wind moved through unfamiliar trees, birds cried from the cliffs, and the ocean breathed steadily against the rocks. Civilization had retreated without ceremony. There were no witnesses, no record written at the time, no one who marked the day. History did not notice when Alexander Selkirk was left behind. And for a very long time afterward, it would forget him completely. Alexander Selkirk was not a hero when he arrived on the island. He was not famous, wealthy, or admired. He was a Scottish sailor, hardened by years at sea, known mostly for his stubbornness and temper. Life aboard ships in that era was exhausting and dangerous, marked by poor food, harsh discipline, and constant uncertainty. Selkirk had argued repeatedly with his captain, convinced that their vessel was rotting and unsafe. He believed it would sink if they continued the voyage. When tensions reached their limit, Selkirk demanded to be put ashore on the nearest land, confident another ship would soon arrive. The captain agreed without hesitation. Supplies were unloaded quickly. There was no farewell. No dramatic pause. Selkirk stepped onto the beach, his boots sinking into the sand, while the crew returned to their ship. Only when the sails filled with wind and the ship began to move did Selkirk realize the finality of what he had done. His anger faded into silence. The ship did not turn back. It sailed on, carrying with it every other human being he knew. The island was beautiful in a quiet, indifferent way. Steep hills rose from the shoreline, covered in grasses and tangled trees shaped by constant wind. Freshwater streams cut narrow paths through the land, flowing steadily toward the sea. Wild goats roamed freely, descendants of animals left behind by earlier sailors. Birds nested in the cliffs, their calls echoing across the valleys. There were no predators, no villages, no signs of recent human presence. At night, darkness arrived completely, unbroken by lanterns or fires beyond Selkirk's own. The stars appeared sharper than he had ever seen from a ship's deck. At first, the island felt enormous and threatening. Every sound carried meaning. Every movement caught his attention. Over time, though, the island revealed patterns. The wind followed predictable paths. Rain arrived in seasons. The goats traveled familiar routes. Slowly, without realizing it, Selkirk began learning the rhythms of a place that did not care whether he lived or died. Selkirk's days became defined by small, practical tasks. He learned which plants were safe to eat and which to avoid. He hunted goats carefully, conserving ammunition until it was gone, then relying on traps and speed. Over time, he learned to run barefoot across sharp rocks, his feet hardening until they barely felt pain. He built simple shelters from wood and grass, repairing them whenever storms tore pieces away. Fire became his constant companion, both for warmth and comfort. At night, he read from the Bible he had brought with him, not always for faith, but for the sound of language, the reminder of structure and meaning. He spoke aloud to himself, just to hear a human voice carried on the air. Days passed without names. Weeks blurred into months. Eventually, Selkirk stopped counting time altogether. The island no longer felt like a place he was trapped in. It became the only place that existed. The greatest challenge Selkirk faced was not hunger or illness, but silence. There were stretches of time when no ships appeared on the horizon, when no unfamiliar sounds broke the routine of wind and waves. Loneliness settled slowly, like mist. To keep his mind steady, Selkirk created routines. He walked the same paths each morning. He checked traps in the same order. He marked seasons by the behavior of animals rather than dates. Sometimes he imagined conversations, replaying old arguments or inventing new ones. Other times, he sat for hours watching the ocean, his thoughts moving as slowly as the clouds overhead. The human mind, when left alone long enough, begins to change. Selkirk adapted by becoming quieter, more observant, less concerned with the world he had left behind. Civilization faded into memory, replaced by a simpler existence shaped by daylight and weather. On rare occasions, sails appeared in the distance. Each time, Selkirk's heart lifted, only to sink again when he recognized the flags. Spanish ships sometimes anchored near the island, their crews searching for water and supplies. Spain and Britain were enemies, and Selkirk knew what capture would mean. He hid in the forests and hills, staying silent as voices echoed through the trees. For days at a time, he remained motionless, listening to footsteps that came painfully close. Rescue was within sight, yet completely unreachable. When the ships finally departed, the island returned to its familiar stillness. Relief and disappointment arrived together. Selkirk survived, but remained alone. Afterward, he would sit by his fire at night, staring into the flames, wondering whether he had made the right choice. There was no one to ask. The island offered no answers. Years later, far more than Selkirk ever expected, an English ship appeared on the horizon. At first, he watched cautiously, unsure whether hope was safe. As the ship drew closer, he recognized familiar details, and something long dormant stirred within him. He ran to the shore, waving, shouting words he had barely spoken in years. When the crew came ashore, they found a man dressed in animal skins, his hair grown long, his movements quick and confident. Selkirk spoke strangely, his voice induced a conversation. He led them to his shelters, showed them how he had lived. The island that had once been a prison now felt reluctant to release him. When Selkirk finally boarded the ship, the shoreline receded slowly. For the first time in years, the island became something distant and unreachable. Life among people again was not easy. Cities felt overwhelming, crowded with noise and motion. Walls felt confining. Nights were restless without the sound of waves and wind. Selkirk told his story, and some listened, though few truly understood it. Eventually, he returned to the sea, unable to remain fully in either world. He died quietly years later, without monuments or celebration. The island remained where it always had, unchanged, indifferent. Alexander Selkirk had lived outside of history for years, shaped not by nations or wars, but by solitude and time. His story survived only because someone remembered to write it down. And even now, it remains a reminder that it is possible, even today, for a human life to unfold almost entirely unseen, carried forward by routine, silence, and the slow rhythm of the natural world. After his rescue, Selkirk often struggled to explain what the island had done to him. It had not merely tested his strength or endurance. It had changed the way he noticed time itself. On the island, nothing hurried him. There were no bells, no schedules, no commands shouted across a deck. Days unfolded naturally, guided by light and shadow. Hunger arrived gradually, not sharply. Fatigue came honestly, earned by movement rather than obligation. The island taught him patience without words. When rain fell, it fell without meaning. When storms came, they passed without apology. Selkirk learned that survival did not require dominance over nature, only attention to it. This lesson followed him long after he left the shore behind. Even among crowds, part of his mind still listened for the sound of wind through trees that no longer surrounded him. That quiet awareness never fully disappeared. During his years alone, Selkirk noticed that memories behaved strangely. Faces from his past slowly lost detail. Voices softened, then faded. Entire conversations vanished, leaving only emotions behind. Anger dulled first. Regret lingered longer. What remained strongest were simple sensations: the warmth of sun on skin, the smell of rain-soaked earth, the steady presence of the ocean. Without anyone to remind him who he had been, Selkirk became someone new. His identity no longer depended on reputation or rank. It was shaped by routine and survival. Silence, once unbearable, became familiar. In that silence, thoughts slowed. He no longer replayed arguments or imagined futures. He lived almost entirely in the present moment. When people later asked how he endured the loneliness, Selkirk could not give a simple answer. He had not defeated silence. He had grown into it. On the island, time ceased to be something measured. Without calendars or clocks, Selkirk relied on the land itself to mark change. The behavior of animals signaled the turning of seasons. The angle of sunlight told him when to rest. Rain patterns became more reliable than memory. Without numbers, time stretched and softened. Days did not feel short or long. They simply existed. This altered sense of time made Selkirk calmer, but it also made returning to civilization difficult. In cities, everything moved too quickly. People hurried toward goals that seemed distant and abstract. Selkirk had learned to value completion rather than progress. A fire built, a meal prepared, a shelter repaired, these were entire accomplishments, not steps towards something else. The island had taught him that life could be complete without ambition. Selkirk's body changed in ways he did not immediately recognize. His movements became efficient and quiet. His senses sharpened. He could hear distant sounds and identify animals by subtle marks in the ground. Hunger no longer frightened him. Pain became information rather than alarm. Living without excess hardened him gently, like stones shaped by water. When he returned to society, people saw only the surface changes, his appearance, his clothing, his strange habits. They did not see how deeply his instincts had been rewritten. The island had not merely kept him alive. It had reshaped him into someone capable of existing with very little. This ability, once essential, became a quiet burden among people who lived surrounded by noise and abundance. One of the most unsettling realizations Selkirk carried was that the island itself remembered nothing of him. No matter how many years he spent there, no matter how carefully he survived, the land showed no attachment. Paths he walked daily disappeared under new growth. Shelters decayed when left unattended. Fires left no lasting mark. The island accepted his presence without acknowledgement and erased it without effort. This understanding gave Selkirk a strange comfort. His suffering had not scarred the world. His solitude had not mattered beyond his own experience. In a way, this freed him. He no longer needed his life to be witnessed to be real. The island had taught him that existence itself was enough. When Selkirk spoke of his time alone, listeners often focused on the drama of survival. They imagined fear, desperation, madness. Selkirk rarely corrected them. Words failed him when he tried to describe the deeper truth. His life on the island had not been constant struggle. Much of it had been quiet, repetitive, even peaceful. He woke, he moved, he observed, he rested. There were days without emotion, either happy nor sad. Civilization expected stories of triumph or despair. Selkirk had experienced something different, a gradual merging with a place that demanded nothing but attention. This subtle transformation was difficult to translate into language meant for crowded rooms. In the end, Alexander Selkirk lived between two worlds and fully belonged to either. The island had stripped life down to its simplest form, and civilization felt unnecessarily heavy by comparison. Yet he could never return to that shore. The island existed now only in memory, untouched and indifferent. Selkirk's story faded quietly after his death, leaving no monument, no boundary marker, no trace on the land that had sustained him. What remained was the idea that a human life could unfold slowly, unseen, guided only by daylight and weather. And somewhere in the vast rhythm of the world, an island continued to exist exactly as it always had, silent, patient, and unaware that it had once been someone's entire universe. Over time, Selkirk discovered that a life could be reduced to a small number of essential movements. Walking, gathering, eating, resting, watching the sky. Each action followed the last without urgency. There was no sense of falling behind. On the island, nothing accumulated. He owned only what he could carry or repair. When something broke, It was either fixed or quietly abandoned. This simplicity slowly eased his mind. Without excess choice, thought itself became lighter. He no longer wondered what might happen next week or next year. His attention rested on what the day required. The sound of wind told him when weather would change. The movement of birds hinted at rain. Hunger arrived as a signal, not a crisis. By living close to these signals, Selkirk felt less separate from the world around him. He was no longer a visitor struggling against the land. He had become part of its daily rhythm, moving when it moved, resting when it rested. Night fell differently on the island than it ever had at sea. Darkness arrived fully, without the scattered lights of ships or distant shores. When the sun disappeared, the land softened into shadow. Selkirk often sat near his fire, listening to insects emerge and the wind settle into a slower rhythm. The stars overhead felt closer, sharper, as though the sky itself had lowered. These nights were long, but not empty. Sounds traveled far in the dark, and Selkirk learned to distinguish them easily. The rustle of animals, the movement of leaves, the steady breathing of the ocean. Sleep came gradually. Sometimes he lay awake for hours, not from worry, but from a calm alertness, as if the island itself remained gently awake around him. In these moments, he felt no separation between himself and the night. There was no need to name the hours. Darkness passed when it was ready. One of the quietest changes Selkirk experienced was the disappearance of meaning. Events no longer carried symbolic weight. A storm was not a punishment. Hunger was not a failure. Survival was not an achievement. Things simply happened. This absence of judgment made life lighter. Without success or failure, there was only continuation. Selkirk stopped asking why events occurred. He focused instead on how to respond. When food was scarce, he adapted. When shelters failed, he rebuilt. The island offered no praise and no criticism. Over time, Selkirk realized how much of human anxiety came from imagined evaluation, from being seen, measured, remembered. Alone, he was free from all of it. His life mattered only because it continued. This realization did not make him despair. It brought him peace. Although Selkirk remained alone, he did not feel entirely companionless. The island itself became a presence, not a friend, but something steady and familiar. He learned its moods. Some days were quiet and open. Others felt heavy with wind and low clouds. He adjusted his behavior instinctively, as one might with a silent partner. There were places he returned to often, a particular tree that offered shade, a ridge that allowed him to watch the horizon, a stream where water flowed reliably. These places anchored him. They did not change, even as time passed unnoticed. In a world without conversation, familiarity became comfort. The island did not speak, but it responded. And that was enough. At first, Selkirk's mind had raced endlessly. Thoughts looped, replaying the past, inventing futures. Over years of solitude, those loops loosened. Thoughts arrived more slowly, and fewer stayed. Long stretches of time passed without internal narration. Selkirk simply existed, aware without commentary. This state was neither dull nor empty. It felt expansive, as though space had opened inside him. He no longer needed distraction. Watching clouds move across the sky could fill an entire afternoon. Listening to rain strike leaves felt complete. The modern idea of boredom had no meaning here. There was always something happening, even if it was small. Especially if it was small. When Selkirk finally returned to human society, people assumed his ordeal had ended. In truth, it had only changed shape. Civilization demanded speed. Decisions piled upon decisions. Noise filled every space. Selkirk carried the island inside him, and it often clashed with the world around him. He missed the clarity of necessity. He missed the honesty of weather. Among people, he felt watched again, evaluated, pulled into stories that moved too quickly. Though he spoke of the island, he rarely spoke of how deeply it had settled into him. There were things language could not carry. The island had taught him how little was required to live, and how much of life elsewhere was excess. Long after Selkirk left, the island continued unchanged. Wind moved through the same trees. Goats followed the same paths. Rain fell, and streams flowed toward the sea. No marker remained of the man who once depended entirely on that land. The island did not remember him, and did not need to. It existed in its own rhythm, patient and unrecorded. Somewhere beyond maps and schedules, it still rises from the ocean, repeating the same quiet patterns it always has. A place where time moves slowly. Where survival requires attention, not urgency. Where a human life once passed gently, almost unnoticed. One of the strangest truths Selkirk learned was that a life could unfold almost entirely without witnesses and still feel complete. On the island, there was no one to confirm his efforts, no one to acknowledge endurance or failure. Each day ended without applause or criticism. At first, this absence felt unsettling, as though his existence might dissolve if unobserved. But slowly, that fear softened. Selkirk realized that awareness itself was enough. He felt hunger when it arrived. He felt warmth when the sun touched his skin. He felt fatigue and rest in honest cycles. Nothing required validation beyond being experienced. This realization quietly reshaped his understanding of purpose. The island demanded no explanation for why he continued living. It simply allowed him to do so. Over time, this freedom from judgment became one of the greatest comforts of solitude. Repetition formed the backbone of Selkirk's days. The same paths walked again and again. The same fire tended morning and night. The same routines repeated with only slight variation. Rather than dulling his awareness, this repetition steadied it. Familiar actions required less thought, allowing his attention to drift outward. He noticed subtle changes in light, in temperature, in the behavior of animals. Small differences stood out precisely because everything else remained the same. In this way, repetition did not trap him. It anchored him. The island became predictable enough to feel safe, yet never fully static. Each day was similar, but never identical. This balance kept his mind calm and engaged without strain. Fear did not disappear all at once. In the early years, it lingered constantly: fear of injury, fear of illness, fear of unseen danger. Over time, though, fear lost its sharpness. Without sudden threats or surprises, it slowly loosened its grip. Selkirk learned which risks mattered and which did not. He moved carefully, but not anxiously. The island did not reward panic. It favored patience. This steady environment taught his nervous system to rest. Fear became a brief signal rather than a permanent state. In its place grew a calm alertness, a readiness that did not exhaust him. This quiet courage was not dramatic. It simply existed, woven into daily life. Without books beyond a single volume, without conversation, without news of the wider world, Selkirk's mind gradually simplified. Thoughts became shorter. Imagined futures lost their urgency. Regrets softened around the edges. There was nothing to compare his life against, no alternate version constantly intruding. This absence of comparison brought relief. He lived exactly where he was, not somewhere else. Attention returned to physical reality: the texture of bark, the smell of smoke, the sound of water over stone. In this stripped-down mental landscape, even small experiences felt complete. The mind, relieved of excess input, became quieter and more spacious. Though Selkirk longed for rescue, he also feared it. Each passing year tied him more closely to the island's rhythm. Rescue would mean change, noise, expectation. It would mean explaining himself again. When ships appeared on the horizon, hope and hesitation rose together. He imagined voices, questions, crowded decks. He wondered whether the world he left behind still existed in a form he could recognize. These thoughts did not stop him from seeking rescue, but they complicated the desire. The island had become familiar, even gentle. Leaving it would require another kind of endurance. What Selkirk learned on the island could not be taught quickly or deliberately. It required time without interruption. Solitude did not offer answers so much as it removed unnecessary questions. Stripped of distraction, life revealed itself as a sequence of moments requiring attention, not interpretation. This education left Selkirk quieter than before, less reactive, more observant. He carried this quietness with him long after leaving the island. Even in busy places, part of him remained still, listening for the slower rhythm beneath the noise. The island had given him that rhythm, and it stayed with him always. Even after Selkirk returned to civilization, his body carried the rhythms and patterns of the island as if it had been quietly rewritten from within, a map invisible to everyone else. His senses had become attuned to subtle differences in wind and temperature that most people would never notice. The sound of a creaking floorboard, the rustle of a bird outside a window, even the faint movement of water in pipes reminded him of streams and tides he had depended upon for survival. Movements that once required effort had become second nature, walking barefoot over rough rock, climbing steep inclines, balancing silently on uneven surfaces. Food tasted differently. The simplest meals brought satisfaction that elaborate preparations rarely could, and excess made him uneasy. Sleep followed natural cues rather than imposed schedules, his body rising with the sun and resting as darkness fell. Noise and hurry unsettled him, while quiet and repetition comforted him. These changes were invisible, but profound. His posture, his gait, even the way he breathed carried the imprint of decades lived in an unchanging environment where every action mattered and every moment was fully observed. His body remembered lessons that his mind could barely articulate, a silent echo of a life that had once been guided only by daylight, wind, and the slow, patient rhythms of an indifferent island. When Selkirk began speaking among people again, he discovered that language itself felt strange, awkward, and unfamiliar, as though his tongue had forgotten how to inhabit it fully. During his decades of solitude, he had spoken aloud only occasionally, mostly to steady his thoughts, to rehearse plans, or to mark the passing of days in a world without clocks. Now, surrounded by conversation, voices rose and fell too quickly, overlapping like waves in a storm. Questions came unexpectedly, expectations followed, and the rhythm of interaction felt alien. He often paused before answering, searching for words that had grown unnecessary during years of quiet. How could he describe the slow, repetitive passage of time, the peace of unbroken days, or the subtle attention that survival demanded? Words seemed inadequate, almost trivial. Listening became his refuge. He traced the flow of speech, noticing tone, pitch, and hesitation as one might observe the rise and fall of tides. Language had returned, but it carried a weight of performance and expectation he had long left behind. Silence had taught him more than speech ever could, and yet he could not leave it behind completely. The act of speaking again was a negotiation between who he had been on the island and who the world now demanded he be, a constant balancing of patience and engagement. Time, as measured by others, reasserted itself slowly and insistently when Selkirk returned to civilization. Clocks, schedules, and timetables demanded attention that the island had never required. Every hour brought obligations, every day a division of work, rest, and movement that felt arbitrary compared to the slow, continuous rhythm of the island. The future arrived with expectation rather than possibility, and the past pressed him with stories of what he had missed. Selkirk felt the weight of these temporal constructs pressing upon him, demanding he act quickly, decide rapidly, and measure himself against moments he could no longer inhabit fully. Yet even amid this new, hurried world, part of his awareness remained anchored to the slow pulse he had known for decades. He noticed details that others ignored, the subtle changes in wind, the light falling differently through a window, the way footsteps echoed in empty hallways. In these observations, he carried the island with him. Time had returned to the world, but he retained a private, slower current, a rhythm that measured neither productivity nor progress, only presence. This internal tempo allowed him to navigate the chaos of human society with a calmness that others envied without understanding its source, a quiet testament to the years he had spent living entirely outside of its expectations. Even when his eyes no longer saw the island, it remained within him, shaping perception, movement, and thought. The land, the wind, the water, the sound of animals moving across rocks, all had left impressions that could not be erased. Selkirk realized that living alone for decades had produced a consciousness attuned to subtlety, to the small and persistent patterns of existence, patterns that civilization often overlooked. He noticed repetition, variation, and rhythm in ways that others could not. A shifting shadow across the ground, a change in the temperature of air, the bending of branches and wind, all conveyed information he understood instinctively. His mind no longer rushed to judgment, nor did it demand constant explanation. Instead, it observed, absorbed, and allowed events to unfold, finding completeness in their mere occurrence. Even in crowds, in cities, in the clamor of human noise, he retained this internal island, a private space of measured perception, quiet endurance, and profound attention. It was not nostalgia, nor longing, nor regret. It was a way of being, shaped not by society, not by history, but by the patient, unyielding rhythms of an isolated life, a life that had existed almost entirely unseen, yet entirely felt. Even after leaving the island, Selkirk carried its silence with him, a quiet presence that followed him into rooms full of people and streets crowded with motion. It was not merely the absence of sound, but a way of sensing the world, a patience born from decades in which every whisper of wind, every shift in the tide, and every soft movement of animals conveyed information that could not be ignored. Civilization moved too quickly, demanding responses, opinions, and reactions at a pace that felt unnatural after years attuned to the rhythm of a solitary land. Yet he discovered that silence could still live within him, a private cadence of thought and perception that allowed him to endure noise without becoming overwhelmed. He noticed subtleties that others missed, the way light fell across a wall at different hours, the faint scent of earth after rain, the minor fluctuations in temperature that told stories of change. In this silence, he found both protection and insight, a way to exist fully even amid chaos. The world around him demanded attention, but the internal quiet he carried acted as a filter, a soft buffer against the constant urgency of human life. In it, he was free to observe, to breathe, and to remember the long days when survival meant noticing everything while speaking almost nothing, when every movement was deliberate, measured, and alive. Selkirk's body and mind had formed habits on the island that refused to leave, subtle traces that shaped every action he took. He walked with awareness of each step, noting the texture of the ground beneath his feet as he had once traced rocky cliffs and sandy shores. He lifted objects with careful attention, aware of balance and resistance, as if every motion carried meaning beyond mere necessity. Food, too, was approached differently. He chewed slowly, tasted deliberately, and appreciated the small abundance that the modern world offered without taking it for granted. His breathing followed a natural rhythm, rising and falling in time with his inner sense of the day, not the dictates of a clock. Even in bustling rooms, he paused for moments to watch, to feel, to allow the space and time around him to register before moving again. These habits were not conscious choices but extensions of survival, ingrained so deeply that they had become automatic, a bridge between who he had been and who he had become. They reminded him constantly of the slow, deliberate, and deeply attentive life he had lived in isolation, a life that had honed every sense and tempered every reaction, leaving him quietly separate from the pace and clamor of the modern world, yet entirely grounded in it at the same time. In the modern world, the future arrived impatiently, demanding decisions, deadlines, and expectations that were foreign to a man who had learned to inhabit each day fully, moment by moment. Selkirk felt the pressure of forward motion pressing against the internal rhythm he had carried for decades. Every new event, every request for attention, seemed to encroach upon a quiet pace that had once defined life itself. Yet he had learned resilience, the ability to move steadily without urgency. He could allow time to unfold slowly within him, even as the external world raced past. This taught him that the future could be held lightly, observed rather than chased, measured by presence rather than accomplishment. He watched as others hurried toward goals, and while he did not dismiss their needs, he realized that life itself did not require constant pursuit. Survival had taught him patience, isolation had taught him attentiveness, and now, reintegrated into society, he could hold both lessons quietly, feeling a steady current beneath the chaos, a reminder that time could flow in multiple ways, and that the slow, deliberate attention cultivated in solitude was as real, as necessary, and as valid as the speed and urgency around him. Even far from the shore, Selkirk carried the ocean within him, a constant presence that flowed beneath thought and movement like a hidden tide. The sound of waves, once a part of every day, now existed in memory, in the subtle rhythm of his heartbeat, in the pace of his breathing, and in the way he moved through space. Salt air, the texture of wet sand beneath his feet, the motion of water against stone, all of these persisted as mental echoes that shaped his perception of distance and direction, of safety and risk, of calm and unease. The modern world had no equivalent to this internal tide. Cities moved in fractured patterns, time was divided into arbitrary increments, and people hurried with little awareness of natural rhythms. Yet Selkirk could feel the pulse of the ocean in his limbs and mind, steady and impartial, reminding him of the way survival once depended on noticing patterns, small changes, and subtle signs. This internal current informed every decision he made, guiding him instinctively in ways he could not always articulate, calming him when noise and haste pressed too hard, sustaining him when expectation demanded more than he wished to give. The ocean within was not dramatic or noisy. It was a patient, persistent force, invisible to others but shaping every aspect of life he now carried back into the world he had once left behind, a reminder that the slow, deliberate attention he had cultivated in isolation was as real and vital as the currents that had once surrounded him. Even in a bustling world, Selkirk's mind and body clung to the persistence of routine, an invisible scaffolding built over years of isolation that dictated small movements, careful attentiveness, and the methodical progression of his day. He rose with the light, even indoors, and oriented his attention first to the basics of survival and comfort: water, warmth, nourishment, movement. Each step, though automatic, carried a weight of memory, the careful placement of feet on uneven terrain, the way the wind signaled rain, the manner in which leaves rustled to mark the passage of hours. These routines were not visible to others. No one observed the careful calibration of every gesture, the way he paused to notice subtle shifts in his surroundings, the gentle sequencing of tasks that allowed him to conserve energy while remaining alert and aware. Civilization demanded speed, improvisation, and constant adjustment, yet the internal structure he carried acted as a counterweight, a quiet, enduring rhythm that allowed him to navigate external chaos without losing the composure honed in isolation. This persistence of routine, cultivated over years with nothing but daylight, weather, and necessity as guides, became a silent companion, a tether to the life he had known, a reminder that even amid noise and haste, measured attention and deliberate movement could sustain and protect, grounding him in a steady, self-contained world of his own making. Selkirk's memories became a living landscape, as vivid and structured in his mind as the island itself had been in reality. He could walk in his imagination across cliffs, valleys, and beaches, noting every tree, every rock, every stream as clearly as if he were there physically. These recollections were not mere nostalgia. They functioned as a cognitive map, shaping perception, attention, and emotion. Even in crowded spaces, the memory of isolation allowed him to filter out distractions, to focus on the essentials, and to measure time in a slower, more deliberate cadence. His mind could return to the island at will, observing tides, clouds, and patterns of animal behavior, even while his body moved through the modern world. Memory became both refuge and framework, a private space where the lessons of solitude, patience, and attentiveness continued to operate without interference from the expectations and noise of society. In this internal landscape, past and present coexisted fluidly, the long, unbroken days of the island intertwined with moments of the world he now inhabited, creating a continuous thread of awareness that was quiet, steady, and deeply sustaining, a reminder that time, attention, and perception could be practiced deliberately, independently of external demands. Selkirk discovered that even in a world rushing forward, he could retain the slowness learned in isolation, a deliberate cadence that shaped the way he moved, spoke, and thought. Minutes did not need to be filled with constant action. Hours could pass without accomplishment or recognition and still feel complete. In meetings, on streets, in crowded rooms, he allowed himself to pause, to notice details that others overlooked: the subtle rise and fall of light through a window, the soft whisper of air over skin, the quiet repetition of distant footsteps. This slowness was not laziness or avoidance. It was an attention, a measured presence that he had cultivated through decades of living alone with nothing but the land, the wind, and the ocean to guide him. Each movement became deliberate, each glance intentional, each breath connected to a steady rhythm that reminded him of days unbroken by urgency. He carried this slowness as both shield and guide, allowing him to observe the world fully while remaining apart from its compulsions, and it became a private form of endurance, a silent education that no other place or person could have provided, a persistent reminder that existence itself could be complete when approached with patience, attention, and quiet awareness. Even after decades in society, the lessons of the island persisted in every ordinary moment. He noticed the quality of light on a table, the subtle shifts of weather in a courtyard, the patterns of movement in crowded streets, and allowed them to inform how he moved and responded. His senses, honed by years of survival, remained alert to slight changes: a branch swaying differently in the wind, a faint scent in the air, a small ripple on water, the nuance of sound carrying distance and meaning. Civilization often ignored these signals, but Selkirk had learned to observe without expectation, to respond without haste, to integrate his attention into the flow of experience rather than imposing artificial speed or urgency. Even mundane actions, pouring water, walking a street, handling objects, were performed with awareness, a quiet precision born of necessity but maintained through habit. Each act carried an echo of the island's teaching, that presence mattered more than accomplishment, that observation was as valuable as speech, and that life could be fully inhabited even without acknowledgement, progress, or measurement. In this way, the island's lessons remained alive within him, shaping every perception and every movement in subtle, almost invisible ways. Freedom, Selkirk realized, was not about escaping constraint or seeking adventure. It was the ability to inhabit each moment fully, without expectation or judgment, without the need for recognition, without anxiety about what might come next. The island had taught him this in ways that could not be communicated easily. Freedom was measured in attention, patience, and quiet endurance, in being fully present for each passing hour, each gust of wind, each ripple of water. Civilization demanded speed, demanded production, demanded visibility, yet he could move through it retaining this private liberty, attending to the world on his own terms, following rhythms only he could perceive. This freedom was subtle, almost invisible, but it was profound. He could choose how to measure time, how to notice, how to respond, and when to pause. It was not the flamboyant liberation of storybooks or heroic narratives, but the deep, calm, unshakable freedom of a life learned in quiet observation, a freedom that neither the expectations nor the noise of society could fully touch, a quiet mastery of self that had been forged through solitude, reflection, and the endless, unhurried passage of days. Above all, Selkirk came to understand life as a continuity, a river flowing steadily whether he noticed it or not. Each day contained the same rhythms: waking, observing, responding, resting, moving through cycles of hunger, work, and reflection. Even in a world of clocks, appointments, and bustling crowds, he felt this continuity as a current beneath the surface, guiding perception, calming thought, and structuring attention. The external world might demand urgency, but internally he remained attuned to a slow unfolding, where each action, each breath, each observation was part of a larger, unbroken sequence. Nothing happened without cause or consequence. Everything existed in relation to what came before and what would come after. This understanding did not make life simpler in terms of activity, but it made it richer in experience, allowing him to inhabit the moment fully without distraction. He moved through time both externally and internally, simultaneously participating in human society while inhabiting the unhurried, measured cadence that had defined his years of solitude, carrying it as an invisible framework, a personal rhythm that shaped all perception, all thought, and all awareness. Selkirk discovered that observation itself could become a kind of meditation, a practice that extended the lessons of solitude into the bustling chaos of society. Even surrounded by crowds, the ceaseless noise, the bright lights, and the relentless motion of other lives, he could slow his awareness, letting it stretch across minutes and hours, noticing what most people overlooked entirely: the pattern of sunlight passing across a wall, the tiny changes in temperature that signaled the coming of rain, the soft but distinct calls of birds that moved across rooftops, the way leaves bent and trembled in subtle gusts of wind. Each of these signals, seemingly trivial to the casual eye, carried meaning he understood instinctively because the island had trained him to notice without haste, to assess without judgment, to live entirely in response to what was present rather than what was imagined or demanded. This patience of observation was not merely a skill but a kind of freedom. He could move through the world at his own internal pace, attentive but undisturbed, feeling fully alive in each instant without needing external validation. Over time, this slow attention became a protective framework, a steady rhythm beneath the chaos of civilization, shaping the way he walked, spoke, and even breathed, a quiet, enduring proof of the lessons he had learned from the island, and a reminder that presence itself could be enough to sustain and nourish a human life. The routine Selkirk had formed on the island persisted even decades later, invisible to anyone observing him, yet profoundly structuring his internal life. He moved through spaces methodically, performing simple tasks with deliberate precision, making a cup of tea, walking to a window to observe the sky, adjusting a chair, noticing the minute shift in light as the day advanced. To anyone watching, these movements might seem ordinary, mundane, or even inconsequential, but each one carried the weight of decades of careful observation, survival, and repetition, a kind of embodied wisdom that could not be erased. Even in moments of apparent leisure, his mind remained quietly attentive, mapping the patterns of the world, predicting subtle changes, adjusting to minor fluctuations in environment and sound. Habits of patience, awareness, and repetition shaped not only his actions but his perception. Every sensory input was received fully, analyzed with a calm deliberation, and integrated into the flow of experience. The quiet power of routine became a shield and guide, allowing him to navigate modern life without being swept away by haste, urgency, or distraction. It was a living extension of the island itself, a constant rhythm that reminded him that survival and comprehension were not acts of struggle but acts of careful attention and deliberate continuity, a practice of being that endured long after the physical demands of isolation had ended. The ocean Selkirk had once depended upon now existed entirely within him, a persistent current of memory, awareness, and instinct that shaped every thought and movement. He could feel it in the rhythm of his breathing, in the way his body adjusted to uneven surfaces, in the subtle calibration of balance and weight as he moved through spaces both natural and constructed. Even in silence, the ocean persisted, a quiet reminder of tides, currents, and the slow, unhurried passage of time. Waves that had once broken on shores he walked daily now echoed in the internal chambers of his memory, reminding him that movement, pressure, and change were constant yet measured, a flow he could perceive and inhabit without force. Modern life presented noise, deadlines, and artificial divisions of time, but the internal ocean carried him beneath it all, steadying the mind, regulating perception, and allowing him to act with calm, deliberate purpose. It was invisible, silent, unobserved by anyone else, yet its influence shaped everything he did, the way he noticed light shifting through a room, the quiet changes in temperature, the soft rustle of leaves or papers, the subtle inflection of human voices. The island had taught him to move with awareness. The ocean within now guided him to move with presence, patience, and persistence, an enduring internal rhythm that no external chaos could entirely disrupt. Selkirk's memory functioned like a landscape, living and layered, with each recollection occupying a physical space in his mind as clearly as if he were walking the island itself. Cliffs, valleys, and streams appeared with vivid clarity, every tree, rock, and hidden path remembered in minute detail, carrying with them the knowledge of years spent observing, surviving, and living fully in the moment. This memory was not sentimental. It was functional, a continuous guide that informed perception, attention, and decision-making even in environments that bore no resemblance to the island. He could trace the behavior of animals, anticipate changes in light or wind, and notice patterns invisible to others, all because the mental landscape of the island remained intact and accessible. It acted as a private framework for his life, allowing him to inhabit the modern world with calm attentiveness while remaining rooted in the practices, rhythms, and lessons learned through decades of solitude. Each memory reinforced the continuity of experience, reminding him that the past was never truly gone, that attention and patience could be trained and maintained, and that the richness of observation cultivated in isolation remained an enduring, protective, and sustaining force in his life, guiding every thought, movement, and perception in subtle but profound ways. Selkirk had learned that the essence of existence could be measured not in accomplishments or recognition but in the quality of slowness, in the deliberate pacing of thought and action that allowed a human being to inhabit the present moment fully. Every movement, every breath, every small observation became a deliberate practice, a continuation of the rhythms learned on the island. Even amidst the rush of society, he could slow himself, drawing attention to details overlooked by nearly everyone, the way sunlight shifted across a room throughout the day, the subtle creak of wood as it expanded and contracted with temperature, the sound of distant conversations mingling with the hum of wind and traffic. This slowness was not stagnation, it was awareness, a deliberate inhabitation of time that allowed the world to be noticed in its entirety. The mind, once accustomed to constant evaluation, judgment, and expectation, now rested in observation, allowing patterns to emerge naturally without force or analysis. Each day became a sequence of extended moments, connected and continuous, where the act of noticing, breathing, and moving itself constituted a complete life. In this deliberate slowness, Selkirk carried the lessons of isolation, the patience of survival, and the quiet mastery of attention into every aspect of modern existence, a rhythm invisible to others but vital to his own endurance and peace. Though physically removed from the island, Selkirk realized that its lessons continued to shape every interaction, every perception, and every response to the modern world. He approached ordinary tasks, pouring water, walking along streets, handling objects, with the same care and attention he had learned while gathering food, climbing cliffs, or maintaining shelters. Every small act became a reflection of survival practices, awareness of balance, economy of movement, anticipation of consequences. Modern life often ignored these subtle rhythms, pressing for speed, noise, and superficial productivity, yet Selkirk moved through it guided by the invisible lessons of observation, patience, and quiet endurance. He noticed imperceptible shifts in temperature, minor variations in light, subtle inflections in human voices, and small changes in the environment that others would pass over entirely. These observations were not exercises in control but in presence, a way of inhabiting life without unnecessary distraction or hurry. In this way, the island's teachings persisted, shaping thought, action, and perception as silently and profoundly as the tides and winds he had once depended upon, reminding him that the continuity of attention, awareness, and careful movement was as vital in a bustling city as it had been on a remote, uninhabited shore. Selkirk had come to understand that attention itself held quiet power, a subtle form of mastery that allowed him to navigate life with calm efficiency while observing details unnoticed by nearly everyone else. It was not the flashy kind of power that drew notice or inspired awe, but a deep, persistent capacity to notice, integrate, and respond to the world in ways that felt instinctive yet deliberate. Even mundane events, a slight shift in light through a window, the soft tremor of leaves in the wind, the delicate cadence of distant footsteps, conveyed information he could interpret with clarity. This sustained attention had been honed over decades of isolation, and it continued to operate within him despite the noise, distraction, and urgency of modern life. He moved with purpose but without haste, responding to what was present rather than to imagined threats or external pressures. In conversation, in observation, in movement, this quiet power allowed him to act in harmony with the environment, to maintain composure, and to feel fully present without forcing outcomes. It was a strength invisible to others but deeply felt within, a form of resilience forged in solitude, preserved in memory, and perpetuated in every deliberate act of awareness he carried forward into society. Above all, Selkirk understood life as a continuous flow, a series of interwoven moments that persisted whether he noticed them or not. Each action, each breath, each observation was part of a larger sequence that extended beyond immediate concern or recognition. In solitude, he had learned to inhabit this continuity fully, attending to subtle changes in the environment, patterns of weather, movement of animals, and shifts in the terrain, understanding that survival required attention to every passing detail. Now, in the modern world, he could carry that same awareness into daily life, moving through time with calm, deliberate pacing, noticing details and rhythms that others missed entirely. Continuity was not about productivity, achievement, or success. It was about inhabiting each moment fully, letting experience unfold naturally, and maintaining a steady rhythm of perception and action that connected past, present, and future in a seamless current. This perspective allowed him to navigate complexity without becoming overwhelmed, to endure without strain, and to exist with a deep, almost meditative awareness of the ongoing flow of life, a living testament to the lessons of solitude, patience, and quiet attention that had shaped him irrevocably. Even in the midst of society, Selkirk retained the habit of stillness, a quiet discipline forged over decades in which each pause, each breath, and each moment of observation was deliberate and intentional. He could stand or sit for long stretches without moving, feeling the subtle fluctuations in the environment around him, the warmth of the sun filtering through a window, the soft pressure of air against his skin, the faint vibrations in the floor from distant movement. Most people would have perceived nothing, their attention drawn only to immediate noise and activity, but he sensed patterns, rhythms, and flows, the invisible currents that shaped every space he inhabited. This stillness was a tool, a lens through which he understood life, a slow unfolding of perception that allowed him to integrate experience fully without haste. Even in conversation, he could pause thoughtfully, letting words settle in silence, noticing micro-expressions, the cadence of speech, the slight shifts of gesture that communicated more than words could. It was not withdrawal. It was deep engagement, a measured presence that allowed him to inhabit both inner and outer worlds simultaneously, carrying the quiet of the island within him while navigating the busy, noisy reality of modern life, a silent mastery of attention that protected him from overwhelm and sustained his awareness of subtle truths. Selkirk realized that learning never truly ended, even in isolation, and even in a world of modern convenience and technology. Knowledge was not only in books or formal instruction, it was in observation, repetition, and reflection. The island had taught him lessons of survival that extended far beyond the immediate physical demands: patience, attention to detail, careful timing, and the capacity to inhabit a moment fully without distraction. In modern life, he applied these lessons in small but meaningful ways, noticing patterns in human behavior, the reliability of natural cycles, or the predictable flow of cause and effect in ordinary actions. Every task became an opportunity to practice awareness: pouring water, walking down a street, observing animals, or tending plants. Even brief experiences were carefully registered, their nuances absorbed, catalogued, and integrated into his understanding of the world. This learning was slow, cumulative, and deeply personal, a continuous process that required no external validation and no hurried achievement. In this way, the discipline of isolation had given him an internal classroom in which the lessons of life were ongoing, subtle, and deeply sustaining, a knowledge that shaped every decision, every perception, and every movement in ways invisible to those around him. Time, which had once been measured by the rising and setting of the sun alone, now returned in fragmented increments, yet Selkirk carried an internal rhythm that allowed him to inhabit each moment fully despite artificial divisions. He observed the passage of minutes and hours not as deadlines or obligations, but as flowing markers of continuity, each segment a canvas upon which experience could unfold naturally. Even amidst the pressures of modern life, he moved with a cadence learned from decades of uninterrupted observation, slow, deliberate, attentive. Each day felt complete in itself, regardless of tasks completed or not, each movement and action registering fully in consciousness. He could notice subtleties others overlooked: the gentle change of light across a room, the rhythm of a neighbor's footsteps, the distant hum of wind and water. These observations were not distractions but continuations of the same careful attention he had cultivated alone. Time became a medium rather than a constraint, a continuous field in which perception and experience were woven together, and in inhabiting it fully, Selkirk found both freedom and stability, a way to live without the rush, hurry, or anxiety that consumed so many of those around him. Selkirk's mind became an internal landscape, vivid and precise, layered with memories, sensations, and subtle patterns that he could navigate as easily as he once walked the island itself. Rocks, cliffs, trees, streams, and beaches lived within him, recalled in exquisite detail, forming a terrain upon which attention, memory, and intuition moved effortlessly. This internal geography was not static. It shifted with reflection, with observation of the present, with the slow unfolding of time, creating pathways for thought and action that were both deliberate and flexible. Even when physically distant from nature, he could mentally traverse this space to inform decisions, to integrate experience, and to maintain a deep calm amidst the distractions of society. Sensory echoes of the island, light on water, the scent of salt air, the sound of waves and wind, remained embedded in perception, shaping responses and maintaining equilibrium. Every detail, from the angle of sunlight to the feel of uneven ground beneath a foot, carried weight in this inner world, allowing him to operate with heightened awareness, resilience, and presence. It was a living, dynamic, private environment that existed entirely within him, sustaining his consciousness and grounding his life long after the physical island had disappeared. Finally, Selkirk understood that life itself was a continuous experience, an unbroken current in which each moment, each sensation, each observation connected seamlessly to what had come before and what would come after. The lessons of solitude had taught him that existence was measured not by recognition, achievement, or speed, but by the fullness with which attention and awareness were applied to each passing moment. Even the smallest actions, breathing, moving, observing, listening, carried significance because they were fully inhabited, deliberate, and integrated into the ongoing flow of experience. In modern life, surrounded by distraction, urgency, and constant demands, this continuity allowed him to navigate each day calmly, maintaining the rhythms, patience, and attentiveness honed over decades. Time, memory, perception, and presence interwove seamlessly, creating a sustained, steady consciousness that endured beneath the noise and chaos of the world. In this understanding, Selkirk found peace, clarity, and mastery, a final testament to the lessons of the island, that life, observed fully and attentively, was complete in itself, continuous, unhurried, and infinitely rich. Selkirk became acutely aware of the rhythm of his own breath, a quiet, continuous cycle that had always accompanied him yet only now revealed itself as a subtle measure of life, time, and attention. In the stillness of both solitude and society, he could trace the inhalation and exhalation, feeling each movement of air expand and contract his lungs, each pulse resonate through his body, each moment of pause carry a weight of presence that few ever acknowledged. This gentle rhythm acted as a compass, guiding his awareness in subtle ways, steadying perception, and shaping both thought and action. In moments of stress or distraction, he could return to this internal cadence, grounding himself in the immediacy of the present, letting the continuity of breath connect him to a deeper, quieter world beneath the noise of daily life. Even as the modern world demanded speed, multitasking, and urgency, the act of noticing his own breathing restored equilibrium, providing a private anchor to which he could return endlessly. Breath became a meditation, a silent teacher, a reminder that life did not need to be forced, that attention itself could sustain awareness, and that the simplest, most fundamental cycles were often the most profound and instructive. Selkirk learned to notice what others would pass by without thought, understanding that small details often carry truths invisible to casual perception. The subtle tremor of leaves in the wind, the minor ripple of water against stone, the quiet sound of footsteps approaching or receding, all spoke to him in ways that were at once immediate and deeply informative. These observations, once essential for survival, now acted as a lens through which he interpreted life, a subtle rhythm of attentiveness that guided his movement, choices, and reflections. Even in cities, in crowded rooms, or amid conversation, He could isolate these minute phenomena, tracing patterns and variations that most overlooked entirely. This was not curiosity alone but a cultivated form of perception, a skill honed by decades of listening, watching, and interacting with the world in its rawest forms. Attention to small things became a form of meditation, reinforcing patience, endurance, and calm, allowing Selkirk to inhabit each passing moment fully, to feel the continuity of existence, and to experience life as a seamless, interconnected web in which even the tiniest shifts mattered and contributed to a broader understanding of rhythm, movement, and presence. Selkirk's time on the island had instilled in him a profound patience, a capacity to wait without urgency, expectation, or complaint. Days often passed with no apparent change, yet every hour carried subtle lessons if one noticed. The migration of birds across the sky, the slow shift of light across rocks, the progression of tides against the shore. In modern life, this patience translated into a quiet confidence, allowing him to wait for insight, for understanding, and for the unfolding of events without forcing outcomes. Others hurried, worried, or demanded immediate results, but he could inhabit each moment fully, knowing that clarity, resolution, and meaning arrived in their own time, unhurried and precise. This patience shaped his interactions, his decisions, and his reflections, allowing him to respond with calm deliberation, integrate observations, and maintain composure when chaos or noise pressed from outside. It was not passive, it was a form of strength, an enduring discipline born of long, quiet days, and it reminded him that waiting, properly observed, was as vital, as informative, and as sustaining as any deliberate action taken in haste. Life, Selkirk realized, was supported by an invisible structure, a framework formed not from laws or social convention but from observation, attention, and measured action. Each step, each movement, each thought could reinforce or disrupt this delicate architecture. He noticed how small changes accumulated, how habits shaped perception, and how attentiveness influenced experience. Even the mundane, the folding of a cloth, the careful placement of a chair, the slow handling of food, carried significance when performed deliberately and observed fully. Civilization often ignored such subtleties, favoring speed, distraction, and superficial engagement, yet he could see the architecture beneath it all, patterns, rhythms, and interconnections invisible to casual eyes but essential to sustaining clarity and calm. Understanding this structure allowed him to inhabit life as a continuous sequence rather than a series of disconnected moments, to perceive causality, to integrate experience fully, and to maintain awareness even amid noise and distraction. Life's invisible framework became a guide, a companion, and a stabilizing force, reminding him that attention and presence, more than action or speech, were the true markers of continuity and coherence in existence. Presence, Selkirk understood, carried its own quiet power. It was the ability to inhabit a space fully, to observe without interference, to listen without judgment, and to act deliberately when necessary. In the bustling rhythm of modern life, presence was almost invisible, yet it shaped both perception and interaction profoundly. He could sit among people, hear every nuance of sound, notice subtle shifts in expression and tone, perceive the faintest changes in air or temperature, and remain calm even when chaos pressed around him. This was a direct continuation of the lessons of isolation: to inhabit time fully, to allow experience to unfold naturally, to integrate perception with action in a deliberate, patient rhythm. Presence became a shield, a teacher, and a practice, a method of sustaining awareness and clarity even in circumstances designed to distract, overwhelm, or divide attention. By inhabiting this silent, attentive state, Selkirk discovered that the external world could never fully disturb the internal continuity he had cultivated, that life could be both engaged and unhurried, and that even the simplest act of attention was a profound expression of mastery over one's own perception. Selkirk had discovered that calm was not something imposed from the outside but cultivated within, a steady current that flowed beneath thought, movement, and perception. Even when the world rushed, demanded, or insisted upon urgency, this calm persisted, an invisible framework guiding attention, action, and reflection. It was neither passive nor forced. It was active awareness, a continuous presence that allowed him to inhabit every moment fully, noticing subtleties invisible to others. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of water, the shifting of light across surfaces, and the quiet cadence of human voices all became part of an internal symphony he could perceive, integrate, and respond to without haste. This calm informed every decision, every movement, every interaction, allowing him to navigate life with patience and resilience. It was the culmination of decades of isolation, observation, and disciplined attention, a living reminder that the mind, trained to inhabit the present and honor the subtle rhythms of the world, could remain steady and composed, no matter how much the external world demanded otherwise. Calm was not merely feeling, it was a form of endurance, a rhythm of existence, and a quiet mastery that allowed life to be experienced fully in every passing moment. Even removed from the island, Selkirk maintained a silent dialogue with nature, a conversation conducted through perception rather than speech. He could feel the approach of wind, the subtle change of light, the shift in temperature, or the distant movement of animals, interpreting these signals instinctively, as if they were messages written in a language older than words. Modern life often obscured such communication, drowning it beneath noise, technology, and distraction, yet he could tune into these rhythms, recognizing patterns that others would dismiss entirely. This dialogue required patience, attention, and presence, and it extended into every corner of daily life. The careful arrangement of objects, the pacing of steps, the deliberate handling of materials, and even the modulation of speech in conversation. Nature's lessons, once survival imperatives, had become guides for living fully and attentively, providing both insight and solace. Through this ongoing dialogue, Selkirk remained anchored, a bridge between the internal landscape of memory and the external realities of a world moving too quickly, a continuous, silent engagement that shaped perception, action, and understanding in ways profound and sustaining. Selkirk came to understand life as an intricate rhythm, a sequence of interconnected experiences in which each moment flowed into the next seamlessly. Attention, observation, and reflection created continuity, forming a cadence that persisted even when external life seemed fragmented or chaotic. He noted how patterns unfolded naturally, how consequences arrived in due time, and how patience allowed understanding to emerge without force. Small actions, repeated and deliberate, shaped the texture of experience, the careful preparation of a meal, the deliberate placement of objects, the observation of subtle environmental changes, the attuned listening to voices and sounds around him. Each gesture, breath, or glance contributed to an ongoing current, connecting past, present, and future in a steady, observable pattern. By inhabiting this rhythm consciously, Selkirk discovered a profound form of stability, one in which life was fully present yet flexible, continuous yet adaptable, slow yet deeply rich. This rhythm was the core of his survival, both literal and psychological, a foundation upon which he could navigate the modern world without losing the lessons of solitude that had shaped him irrevocably. Presence, cultivated over decades of isolation, became Selkirk's guiding principle, the continuous thread linking perception, thought, and action. To be present was not merely to exist in a space but to inhabit it fully, to allow the senses to absorb, register, and integrate information without haste or distraction. Every nuance of sound, light, temperature, and movement was attended to, forming a rich tapestry of experience that extended far beyond the superficial engagement of ordinary life. Even in the midst of social interactions, the pulse of modern routines, and the unrelenting flow of external expectation, he could anchor himself in presence, maintaining clarity and composure while remaining attentive to subtle shifts in the environment. Presence became both compass and shield, enabling him to navigate challenges without haste, to respond deliberately, and to experience each moment fully. It was a quiet mastery, an enduring education of the senses, attention, and awareness, forged in solitude and carried seamlessly into the complexities of everyday existence, a continuity that sustained both mind and body and ensured that life remained fully inhabitable, rich, and profound. Finally, Selkirk understood the fullness of time, not as a measurement or schedule imposed by society, but as a lived, continuous experience in which each moment mattered precisely because it was observed, inhabited, and integrated. Time was no longer an abstract construct but a rhythm woven into his own awareness, a steady current that connected the lessons of isolation, the depth of perception, and the continuity of attention into a coherent, living whole. Every breath, step, and gesture flowed naturally into the next, forming a seamless sequence in which life was fully present, fully appreciated, and fully understood. Even amidst external noise, distraction, and the relentless pace of modern existence, he could inhabit time calmly, observing patterns, registering nuances, and moving in harmony with both internal and external rhythms. This understanding brought a profound peace, a sense of completeness, and a mastery over perception and awareness that had been cultivated over decades in solitude. Life, fully observed and patiently attended, was continuous, rich, and infinitely expansive, a living testament to the enduring power of attention, memory, and deliberate presence, and to the quiet, sustaining lessons of the island that had shaped him irrevocably.